Hi there, welcome back to another one of my orchestration videos. In this video I'll be looking at 10 orchestration examples from the Lord of the Rings Return of the King soundtrack. The goal of this video is to just give you some takeaways, some concepts that you can then apply to your own music. Before I dive in, just a quick note about my source material. I'm using an orchestral arrangement that is a medley of tracks from Return of the King, designed for a concert performance as my source material. It is an officially licensed version though, so I'm assuming that the person doing the arranging had access to the original manuscript and that the goal was to make them sound as authentic as possible for audiences. So where there are differences between what's on the soundtrack and what's on the score that I've noticed, I've tried to annotate them. So without further ado, here's the first example. So our first example is from the very opening of the film. So the way this works is we have basically two main categories. We have lead parts and then we have accompanying parts. So in the lead we obviously have the solo oboe to start with, and that's accompanied by violin 2, viola and cello, just creating a pad. And layering with that pad we have this harp, which to me gives it a slightly folky feel and also helps to mark the time by just adding a little bit of definition at the front of each chord. And then we just have the triangle, which is a little bit of extra spice in the second bar. And then my big takeaway from this example is how we have a repetition and everything just grows a little bit larger. So you have the entry of the basses doubled by the bassoon, and the oboe melody is doubled by the first violins. In addition, you also have the clarinets doubling the violin 2 and viola part. Next we have the statement of the ring theme, which coincides with the main titles. So again, really simple. We just have the main melody in the violins and later the flute, violas and cellos accompanying them in octaves with this arpeggio, and then the bassoons and the horns holding down chord tones, gelling everything together. My takeaway from this one is how the melodic line continues all the way through the end of the second bar here, but the E kind of gets stuck and continues to play underneath the F sharp and the G. It just creates this lovely moment of tension before things resolve harmonically in the following bar. Also notice that there's no bass in this section of the music. Part of good orchestration is about knowing when to hold things back so that you have lots of contrast within your piece. The next example is from Minas Tirith. So this is definitely an underscore type track. There isn't really a melody, it's more about this riffy bass line. So that's being played in unison in the cellos and double basses. Then in the same register we have the tuba sustains and the bassoon sustains in fifths. So because the sustains are in the same register as the riff, it kind of muddies everything up, it makes it all quite clashy in a cool way. And then you just have this very quiet percussion part, which is just creating this quite continuous, rumbly texture. There's something about rolls that are very quiet dynamic that feels inherently quite intense. Next we have the Minas Tirith or Gondor theme proper. So we have the lead melody, which is played mainly by the trumpet, and then later trumpet and French horn in octaves. Those are the primary colours, and then I think they're supported by the woodwinds. Then pretty much everything else is doing this repetitive rhythmic riff. Notice how the timpani version is slightly simplified, which I guess just creates a bit more space in the low end. And then to my ears, it sounds like there might be a continuous layer of timpani rolls or some other kind of drum roll, just creating this kind of wash of sound in the background. Next up, we have an excerpt from Minas Morgul. So to me, the thing that strikes me most about this example is the use of sequences that themselves loop. So we have one sequence in the woodwinds and trumpet, and then another sequence in the bass trombone and tuba and lower strings. Overall, I just get this feeling of something very mathematical, very mechanistic, kind of relentless. There's a kind of predictability and certainty about it. It just kind of keeps driving on. At the same time, that predictability feels offset by the strangeness of the harmony there compared to other things that we've heard in the soundtrack so far. Next, we have an excerpt from Anduril. My takeaway from this one is how a combination of factors just create this gradual sense of build and development. So when we start, we have this quite mellow melody, mainly in the horns, with the lower horn part, the viola and the violin too, just sustaining a G. So there aren't a whole lot of chord tones being filled in at the moment. And even this arpeggio figure hasn't quite blossomed yet into the full arpeggio. The bassoon rhythm has the effect of emphasizing that offbeat in the cello part. Subtly, it just creates a little bit of extra instability. By the third bar, the horns, the violin twos, the violas have moved from playing a single note to playing two notes in thirds. So the orchestration just warming up a little bit more. Then here, the bassoon drops its offbeat emphasis as the trumpet comes to the foreground. And by this time we have the full arpeggio pattern, so lots of things just opening up there. Let's have a listen to The Black Gate Opens. So a couple of observations. Obviously you have this block chord melody in the winds. When everything's playing like this, it's always the brass that take precedence and the woodwinds kind of supporting and fattening the sound. You have this lovely spacious string voicing that is particularly effective at creating that high-end shimmer. I love how the high strings drop out here and then rejoin, doubling the melody. So it gets this little second wind of energy. The next excerpt is from the same track on the soundtrack towards the end. So this section is really built around the call and response between the horns and the trumpets, with a little connecting phrase added by the first violins, doubled by the oboe. So to me, the brass feels in the foreground, whereas the violin oboe line feels more like a backing vocal or a supportive line. So I really like that interplay between a call and response with two similar colours and then a contrasting colour sort of helping to stitch them together. And then the rest of the orchestration is just some pads, so the sustained strings, flute, bassoon and horn, as well as the timpani that just gives it a bit of extra weight and excitement. Next up we have one of the main themes of the film series. So this orchestration is all about that huge melody. And so my takeaway for this one is just how many instruments are playing it. You've got the violin ones and violin two in octaves, then doubling the violin two you have the viola, and then an octave below that you've got the cellos, and they're all just playing the melody in grand octaves there. You also have the clarinets, which are just, again, thickening out the sound without changing the colour that much. The clarinet's quite a mellow sound, and so it's still that string sound that predominates. You have this really simple, stately, hymn-like bass line in the basses and doubled in the bassoons and the trombones. Then you have the lower brass just creating block chords to fill out the harmony. You might call that a brass chorale, and that's also joined by the lower clarinets, just thickening things out again in quite a neutral way. By the sound of it, there's also a little bit of choir in there, which is not notated here. On to our final example now. This one's called the Grey Havens. So this orchestration just feels super clean to me, especially in the high end. If we just listen again to how the high end density is managed, it starts with this very exposed melody, quite far away from any other instruments in the upper strings and also the flutes and oboes. Then there's a little bit of shimmer as this lower string part comes in the violin 1's divisi, and then it disappears, and again you get this really nice isolated high melody before then finally we get this nice warm chord at the end. So let's have another listen. So that melody just on its own, then it's joined by another high string part, and then it's just on its own again, and it's got loads of space. And then that decision to drop the last part of the melody down an octave to just bring all the instruments a bit closer together. Overall, as you can just see from the amount of rests on the page, this is a very light orchestration. It feels like just a handful of colours very deliberately chosen, and colours that are generally going to create quite a mellow tone. Just a sprinkling of woodwind, mostly strings, and then the horns creating a bit of warmth, and the harp just adding a delicate little bit of movement there as well. So there we have it, 10 orchestration moments from Lord of the Rings Return of the King. I hope you found that enjoyable. This is a format of video that I'm trying to do more of, taking 10 examples from some genre or from across multiple films. So let me know if there's any particular types of scores you'd like me to focus on. It's largely dictated by what I can get access to in terms of full orchestral scores, just so I can be sure that I'm giving accurate information as much as possible. But yes, thank you very much for watching. Do check out some other videos, and in the meantime, thanks for your attention, and I'll see you on the next video.